The Americans, Chapter 9, Expanding Markets and Moving West, Section 3, Expansion in Texas. In 1821, Stephen F. Austin led the first of several groups of American settlers to a fertile area as good in every respect as man could wish for, land first rate, plenty of timber, fine water, beautifully rolling, along the Brazos River. However, Austin's plans didn't work out as well as he had hoped. 12 years later, he found himself in a Mexican prison and his new homeland in an uproar. After his release, Austin spoke about the impending crisis between Texas and Mexico. A personal voice, Stephen F. Austin.
Texas needs peace and a local government. Its inhabitants are farmers, and they need a calm and quiet life. But my efforts to serve Texas involved me in the labyrinth of Mexican politics. I was arrested and have suffered a long persecution and imprisonment. I fully hoped to have found Texas at peace and in tranquility, but regret to find it in commotion, all disorganized, all in anarchy, and threatened with immediate hostilities. Can this state of things exist without precipitating the country into war? I think it cannot.
Austin's warning proved to be prophetic. The conflict between Texas and Mexico would soon escalate into bloody struggle. Part 1. Americans settle in the Southwest. During 3 centuries of Spanish rule of Mexico, only a few thousand Mexican settlers had migrated to the vast landscape of what is now Texas. Despite the region's rich natural resources and a climate conducive to agriculture, a number of problems scared off many potential Mexican settlers. One was the growing friction between Native American and Mexican inhabitants of the area. The mission system. Since the earliest Spanish settlements, the Native Americans and Mexican populations in the Southwest had come into close contact. Before Mexico won its independence in 1821, Spain's system of Roman Catholic missions in California, New Mexico, and Texas tried to convert Native Americans to Catholicism and to settle them on mission lands. To protect the mission, Spanish soldiers manned nearby presidios, or forts. The mission system declined during the 1820s and 1830s after Mexico had won its independence. After wresting the missions from Spanish control, the Mexican government offered the surrounding lands to government officials and ranchers. While some Native Americans were forced to remain as unpaid laborers, many others fled the missions, returning to traditional ways. When Mexicans captured Native Americans for forced labor, groups of hostile Comanche and Apache retaliated by sweeping through Texas, terrorizing Mexican settlements, and stealing livestock that supported many American settlers and Mexican settlers, or Tejanos. The impact of Mexican independence. Trade opportunities between Mexico's northern provinces and the United States multiplied. Tejano livestock, mostly longhorn cattle, provided tallow, hides, and other commercial goods to trade in Santa Fe, New Mexico, north and west of Texas. Newly free, Mexico sought to improve its economy. Toward that end, the country eased trade restrictions and made trade with the United States more attractive than trade between northern Mexico and other sections of Mexico. Gradually, the ties loosened between Mexico and its northern provinces, which included present-day New Mexico, California, Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. Mexico was beginning to discover what Spain had previously learned. Owning a vast territory did not necessarily mean controlling it. Mexico City, the seat of the Mexican government, lay far from the northern provinces and often seemed indifferent to the problems of settlers in Texas. Native American groups such as the Apache and Comanche continued to threaten the thinly scattered Mexican settlements in New Mexico and Texas. Consequently, the Mexican government began to look for ways to strengthen ties between Mexico City and the northern provinces. Mexico invites U.S. settlers. To prevent border violations by horse thieves and to protect the territory from Native American attacks, the Mexican government encouraged American farmers to settle in Texas. In 1821 and again in 1823 and 1824, Mexico offered enormous land grants to agents who were called empresarios. The empresarios, in turn, attracted American settlers, who eagerly bought cheap land in return for a pledge to obey Mexican laws and observe the official religion of Roman Catholicism. Many Americans, as well as Mexicans, rushed at the chance. The same restless determination that produced new inventions and manufactured goods fed the American urge to remove any barrier to settlement of the West. The population of Anglo- or English-speaking settlers from Europe and the United States soon surpassed the population of Tejanos who lived in Texas. Until the 1830s, the Anglo settlers lived as naturalized Mexican citizens. Austin, in Texas. The most successful impresario, Stephen F. Austin, established a colony between the Brazos and Colorado rivers, where no drunkard, no gambler, no profane swearer, and no idler would be allowed. By 1825, Austin had issued 297 land grants to the group that later became known as Texas's Old 300. Each family received 177 very inexpensive acres of farmland, or 4,428 acres for stock grazing, as well as a 10-year exemption from paying taxes.
I am convinced, Austin said, that I could take on 1,500 families as easily as 300.
At the colony's capital in San Felipe, a visiting blacksmith, Noah Smithwick, described the established town, with weddings and other social gatherings. Smithwick stayed in a simple house, but learned that, in the course of time, the pole cabin gave place to a handsome brick house, and that the rude furnishings were replaced by the best the country boasted. In 1836, Mary Austin Hawley, Stephen Austin's cousin, wrote admiringly about towns such as Galveston on the Gulf Coast and Bastrop. A personal voice, Mary Austin Hawley. Bastrop continues to grow rapidly. It is favorite spot for new settlers and is quite the rage at present. It is situated on a bend of the Colorado, sloping beautifully down to the water, with ranges of timber, first oak, then pine, then cedar, rising in regular succession behind it. Word about Texas spread throughout the United States. Posters boldly stated, "Go to Texas," confident that Texas eventually would yield great wealth. Americans increasingly discussed extending the U.S. boundaries to the river they called the Rio Grande, known in Mexico as the Rio Bravo. President John Quincy Adams had previously offered to buy Texas for $1 million. President Andrew Jackson later upped the bid to $5 million. Mexico not only refused to sell Texas, but also began to regret its hospitality to Anglo immigrants. Part 2. Texas fights for independence. As Texas's Anglo population surged, tensions grew with Mexico over cultural differences, as well as slavery. The overwhelmingly Protestant settlers spoke English rather than Spanish. Many of the settlers were southern cotton or sugar farmers who had brought slaves with them. Mexico, which had abolished slavery in 1824, insisted in vain that Texans free their slaves.
Come to Texas.
In 1830, Mexico sealed its borders and slapped a heavy tax on the importation of American goods. Mexico, however, lacked sufficient troops to police its borders well. Despite restrictions, the Anglo population of Texas doubled between 1830 and 1834. In 1834, Austin won a repeal of the prohibition on immigration. By 1835, more than 1,000 Anglos each month streamed into Texas, scrawling the initials GTT on their doors to indicate that they had gone to Texas. A year later, Texas's population included only 3,500 Tejanos, 12,000 Native Americans, 45,000 Anglos, and 5,000 African Americans. Meanwhile, Mexican politics became increasingly unstable. Austin had traveled to Mexico City in late 1833 to present petitions for greater self-government for Texas to Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna. While Austin was on his way home, Santa Anna suspended the 1824 Mexican Constitution and had Austin imprisoned for inciting revolution. After Santa Anna revoked local powers in Texas and other Mexican states, several rebellions erupted, including what would eventually be known as the Texas Revolution. Remember the Alamo. Austin had argued with Santa Anna for self-government for Texas, but without success. Determined to force Texas to obey laws he had established, Santa Anna marched towards San Antonio at the head of a 4,000-member army. At the same time, Austin and his followers issued a call for Texans to arm themselves. Late in 1835, the Texans attacked. They drove the Mexican forces from the Alamo, an abandoned mission and fort. In response, Santa Anna swept northward and destroyed the small American garrison in the Alamo. All 187 U.S. defenders died, including the famous frontiersman Jim Bowie, who had designed the razor-sharp Bowie knife, and Davy Crockett, who sported a raccoon cap with a long tail hanging down his back. Hundreds of Mexicans also perished. Only a few women and children were spared. The Lone Star Republic. Later, in March of 1836, Santa Anna's troops executed 300 rebels at Goliad. The Alamo and Goliad victories would prove costly for Santa Anna. 6 weeks after the defeat of the Alamo, on April 21st, the Texans struck back. Led by Sam Houston, they defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. With shouts of "Remember the Alamo!" the Texans killed 630 of Santa Anna's soldiers in 18 minutes and captured Santa Anna. The victorious Texans set Santa Anna free after he signed the Treaty of Velasco, which granted independence to Texas. In September 1836, Houston became president of the Republic of Texas. The new Lone Star Republic set up an army and navy and proudly flew its new flag with a lone gold star. Texas joins the Union. On March 2, 1836, as the battle for the Alamo was raging, Texans had declared their independence from Mexico, believing that Mexico had deprived them of their fundamental rights. The Texas rebels had likened themselves to the American colonials who had chafed under British rule 60 years earlier. On March 16th, they ratified a constitution based on that of the United States. In 1838, Sam Houston invited the United States to annex or incorporate the Texas Republic into the United States. Most people within Texas hoped this would happen. U.S. opinion, however, divided along sectional lines. Southerners sought to extend slavery already established in Texas. Northerners feared that annexation of more slave territory would tip the uneasy balance in the Senate in favor of slave states and prompt war with Mexico. Then in 1844, the U.S. presidential election featured a debate on westward expansion. The man who would win the presidency, James K. Polk, a slaveholder, firmly favored annexation of Texas at the earliest practicable period. On December 29, 1845, Texas became the 28th state in the Union. A furious Mexican government recalled its ambassador from Washington. Events were moving quickly toward war.